Former U.S. President Donald Trump states China is trying to replace the dollar as #1 currency. Former U.S. President Donald Trump has acknowledged the push that China is making to dethrone the dollar as a reserve currency. In a post published on Truth Social, Trump stated that if this comes to happen, it would be the biggest defeat in the history of the U.S. in the last 200 years. Donald Trump, former president of the U.S., has recognized the recent moves that China and other countries including Russia and Saudi Arabia are taking to undermine the influence of the dollar in world markets. In a post published in Truth Social, the social platform founded by Trump, he
The dollar is facing a revolt. The world knows it as the king of currencies, but the dominance of the dollar is now under threat. More and more countries are looking for alternatives, and China's yuan is emerging as a clear challenger. Beijing is pursuing a string of deals. The latest one is with Brazil. Brazil and China are ditching the dollar. From now on, they'll use their own currencies for trade. So China is pushing the yuan. What about the Indian rupee? It's not far behind. The Indian rupee is also emerging as a serious contender. And why are these trends significant? Because currencies drive commerce. The dollar's dominance gives the US an outsized influence on the global economy, and a shift away from the dollar will only hurt America. It will also hasten the rebalancing of the global economy. In the next few minutes, we'll look at this trend and where this is going. First, the events in Brazil. Brazil announced the deal yesterday, and it did not come out of the blue. The agreement had been in the works for a while. A preliminary pact was signed in the month of January. It laid the foundations of the final agreement, and it's a fairly simple deal. Earlier, Brazil and China used the US dollar for trade. Now they will deal in their native currencies. China will use the yuan, and Brazil will use the Brazilian reais. How does it help? It will save costs. Look at the official statement from Brazil. This is what it says. The expectation is that this will reduce costs, promote even greater bilateral trade, and facilitate investment. China is Brazil's biggest trading partner. Last year, their bilateral trade was worth over $150 billion. So it makes sense for Brazil to ditch the dollar. But what's in it for China? Beijing is on a mission. It wants to internationalize the yuan. It is building a large coalition of partners. These are countries that will use the yuan instead of the US dollar, and Beijing has made considerable progress in this direction. It has secured bilateral pacts with 41 countries so far. The total value of these agreements is more than $500 billion. So the yuan is gaining international acceptance. And the petro-yuan is rising. Now, what is the petro-yuan? It's not a different currency. Petro-yuan is simply using the yuan to settle oil bills, just like the petrodollar. And China is making an aggressive push for this. It is finding takers in oil-producing nations. Russia, for instance, it has embraced the yuan. So have Iran, Venezuela, and some African nations. Now, reports say Saudi Arabia is also considering the switch from the dollar to the yuan. And this is going to be a very important development. We know that Riyadh has been at odds with Washington and is getting closer to Beijing. But ditching the dollar will be a decisive move. Meanwhile, the Indian rupee is also competing in this race. Last year, India's Reserve Bank made a move. It allowed international trade settlements in the Indian rupee. It's still early days, but India has made progress. Banks in 18 countries have shown interest. They've opened special accounts, and these accounts will help them settle trade payments in the Indian rupee. And these are the countries we're talking about. They're ditching the dollar. They want to use the Indian rupee for trade with India. Earlier this year, Brazil and Argentina floated an idea. They're thinking about a common currency for South America. Halfway across the world, Southeast Asia too is losing patience with the US dollar. In Africa, countries like Kenya are dumping the dollar. They'll use the Kenyan shilling for oil imports. So here's a question. Why is all of this happening now? Why is there a global rebellion against the dollar? Also, how did the dollar become the world's reserve currency? It happened after the Second World War in the year 1944. 44 allied countries met at Bretton Woods in the US. 44 countries came together. They wanted to avoid another financial turmoil, so they created a system, a set of rules that would shape the global economy as we know it today. It led to the creation of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, also the World Bank. The Allies also agreed to a new exchange rate system. Each country pegged the value of its currency to the US dollar, and that's how the American dollar gained its dominance. The Bretton Woods Conference gave the US immense power to dominate the global economy. It created two financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, largely controlled by America. And they're still quite powerful and still led by the US. As for the dollar, it is still widely used, both inside and outside the US. About $1 trillion notes are in circulation outside America. Some 40% of the world's debt is issued in US dollars. Nearly 60% of the global currency reserves are in US dollars, and close to 90% of all foreign exchange trade involves the US dollar. The world economy is hooked to the dollar.